Today, we're joined by Alex Farah, an absolute powerhouse in primary science. Alex is a PSQM Regional Lead for the East Midlands. She's a hub leader for Southwest London and an accredited trainer in the primary science capital teaching approach. On top of all that, she's a Primary Science Teaching Trust Fellow, co-author of some fantastic resources like See-Through Science and Sketchbook Science and Eclipse Primary Ambassador. We'll be looking at how to shape more inclusive classrooms, the challenges that teachers may face when doing this, and practical strategies and resources to support this work. So if you're ready, let's go ahead and chat with Alex. Okay. Alex, hello, and a massive welcome to the Primary Science Podcast. How's it all going?
Great, thank you. Really lovely to see you today.
Wonderful. Yeah, you too. And it's an absolute privilege to have you with us. And I just can't wait to dive into it all today. And I've done a little introduction for you, but I just wonder if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and all the amazing work that you do with primary science.
Of course. Well, I do all sorts of different things in my week. So first and foremost, I'm a teacher. I'm a science teacher, a primary science teacher, but my background was actually in secondary science. So I'm very much enjoying for the last several years working with primary age children. But I don't spend all of my week doing that. I also work with teachers for lots of the week. So I'm a Primary Science Quality Mark hub leader, and I work with a hub of teachers who are completing the Primary Science Quality Mark CPD programme in Southwest London. But I'm also the Primary Science Quality Mark Regional Lead for the East Midlands. So I work with lots of hub leaders promoting primary science in the East Midlands. That's what I spend my week doing, which is lots of fun, and it's fantastic to work with so many wonderful people in all sorts of different ways.
Wow. Yeah, it sounds like you're a very busy person and that you care deeply about primary science. It's obviously a passion for you, and therefore you are having such a big impact. Hopefully those are things that we'll be able to touch upon today, all the different things that you're involved in and how that can help us teachers and us science leaders just develop better education for the students. And it's just honestly such an inspiration. We're all dying to get to know you a little bit better. So if it's okay, I would love to do our quick fire 5. Do you think you'd be up for that?
I'll try my best.
Yeah. Okay. It'll be fantastic. Okay, so question 1. What was your experience with science when you were at primary school?
Very unfortunately, I can't remember doing any science at primary school at all. You sort of think maybe, surely I must have done some, but I can't actually ever remember doing any science at primary school. I can remember secondary school. Maybe it's not just my memory. I can remember doing some science at secondary school, but I suppose perhaps the important thing is probably that nobody put me off science. So whatever we did do or didn't do at primary school, I didn't get put off. And I very much remember loving science, though perhaps I didn't do any. But I had a chemistry set at home, and I remember very much, I can picture my chemistry set now on a little shelf that I managed to mix together in all sorts of unsafe ways, many different chemicals. So at a primary age, I was definitely loving science. No one had put me off. Maybe people had encouraged me. I also had a lot of shells that I kept in jars, and the jars were full of water, and my shells sat in the water. So I was doing science, but possibly not much at school.
Maybe, yeah. It sounds like you were a born scientist. Who knows? Maybe your teachers were so good that it didn't feel like a lesson.
Subtle science.
It was the subtle science. They were artists. Okay, good. That's nice. And question 2, what book or article that you've read recently has inspired your thinking?
Well, at the moment, I am very much into words and developing vocabulary. So the Alex Quigley book, the Closing the Vocabulary Gap, I've been reading, and lots of articles and blogs about how to develop vocabulary. I love reading myself, and I love words, and I love playing around with words. I'm very interested over the last year with really making sure that I try to develop science vocabulary in the children that I teach as much as possible. So I would say books about vocabulary. I've been reading interesting ones as well. Giles Brandreth and Susie Dent, who are not to do with science vocabulary so much, but more playing around with words in perhaps a bit more of an English prose type of way. But that's something that I've been enjoying recently.
Yeah, that's interesting you say that because so I work at an international school here in Bangkok, Thailand, and you know, of course, with any students, any primary students, words, vocabulary, and science is a big thing, but it's especially even more of a big thing here. So I would love to later on perhaps hear your insights into word games and how to develop that vocabulary because that's definitely a big focus for us. Okay, question 3. Can you describe your perfect holiday or adventure?
Oh, yes. Well, I would say certainly not too hot, and maybe with very good views, maybe very high up. Perhaps you have to go there in a cable car. Very luxurious, maybe with a bit of a spa, maybe with a bit of a log fire, and lots of walking around. That's what I would go for. Sadly, one isn't
Ah,
on the
okay.
books in the next couple of weeks, but maybe soon.
Yeah, maybe one day. Yeah, maybe next year. So it sounds like hiking up in the mountains or something like that.
Yeah, that would be perfect.
Nice. Okay. All right. So question 4. If you could instantly, just at the click of a finger, master any skill and outside of science, what would it be?
So has it got to be a real skill? Can I have teleportation or not?
No, it could be anything.
Oh, so I think I'd quite like to be able to teleport anywhere. But if I had to be slightly more realistic, I'd like to be an amazing singer. That would be quite good. I know we're supposed to have a growth mindset, and I know
Yeah.
everything should be possible. But to be honest, being a great singer really isn't looking likely for me at the
Yeah.
moment. I suppose I've gone a bit wild and said more than one now, but I'd quite like to be able to make amazing crocheted gloves. Only because
Hmm.
my daughter has a beautiful pair of handmade crocheted gloves. I wouldn't want anything else, just to be able to make those gloves. That might be more realistic than teleportation, I suppose.
Okay, interesting. Crocheting classes are in your future, as well as hiking in the mountains.
Learning how to crochet might also be more realistic than actually learning how to sing beautifully, to be honest.
Okay, what would you sing? Just out of interest, an extra question.
Oh, that was a bit of a tricky one. I suppose, good 80s tunes.
Okay, yeah, we all like the 80s. Nice.
Disco.
Okay,
Yeah, yeah,
bit of 80s disco. I like
definitely.
that. Okay. Um, last but not least, question 5.
Ooh.
What scientific discovery would you say that has changed life as we know it the most? So everything from the invention of the wheel until current day.
Yeah, I do think about this quite often. I used to do a lot of STEAM lessons at the school that I teach at, Wimbledon High School, and I used to do STEAM lessons for pupils from reception all the way up to year 13, and we had a series of STEAM lessons that were to do with really significant innovations or inventions. And I tried to find out at one point who had been responsible, or which scientist, which engineer, or which innovation had been responsible for saving the most lives. And I was quite surprised. I mean, there's obviously quite a lot of debate about that. I thought it might be someone like Alexander Fleming, or sort of penicillin and antibiotics, which I suppose would be an obvious answer to your question. And I was quite surprised that something like Harbour and Bosch making fertilizers has probably been pretty significant, really. So our supply of food and our supply of enough food in the world. So I suppose I'd probably say fertilizers and food and food practices. Though if I could look into the future, I think I'm quite looking forward to self-driving cars. So if I could have one from the future, I think that could change my life, really. Obviously, I wouldn't need them so much if I had the teleportation, but if I didn't have the teleportation, then I think I might need the self-driving cars, I think.
Yeah, I'm with you on that one. And yeah, that one took me by surprise with the fertilizer, but it's a very logical answer, to be fair. Yeah, that's true. I
Yeah.
like it a lot. And that's it. That's the quick fire five. You did
Excellent.
it.
I was quick enough.
Yeah, I think that was under 5 minutes. It was good
Good.
enough.
Good.
So let's dive right in. And today we're talking about specifically inclusivity and equitability in primary science education. And I just think it's important to define this first. So, what does inclusivity mean to you, sort of in the context of primary science, and why is it so important?
Yeah, well, I want all of the pupils that I teach, not just some of them, but all of the pupils to think that science is a subject that is for them. So, really thinking about developing the science identity of all pupils. And if we think of a class that we teach, we can very easily think of the what we might call sciencey pupils, the ones that just absolutely love science and are always asking questions and always answering questions. And I think that it's sometimes a little bit easy to get distracted by those sciencey pupils, but what we need to remember is that our job is to make sure that all of them think that science is for them, all of them think that science is part of their future, that they can, whatever they want to do, they can use their science skills and they can be good at science. So many pupils think that science is for someone else, science is for the one over there that's really good at it in the other side of the classroom. But trying to think about what we do and how we teach science and how we portray science so that every pupil thinks that it is for them. That's how I think of it. Now, of course, there's all sorts of other aspects, and it's a huge issue, and a huge issue about ensuring that science is accessible for all pupils. But I think at the heart of it, for me, it's to do with a science identity. And thinking about science for pupils' futures, there are big issues to tackle. Say, for example, the numbers of girls that take A-level physics, and the numbers of pupils from diverse backgrounds and what their representation might be in certain occupations. But as a start point, I think that building a science identity for all pupils is the priority to think about.
Yeah, that's key. And that makes science so much more meaningful to us all. And I think once as teachers and as leadership, we understand that point, I think that's it'll be much easier to trickle down into the students and everyone can experience science in a positive way.
I think it's not enough for them to just enjoy it. And lots of pupils really enjoy science and they think it's their favourite subject and they absolutely love it. But it isn't enough to just enjoy it, because those ones that might really love it, they may still think that science is for someone else and science is for people like them. And unfortunately, reports such as the Aspires report, it shows us that most children don't actually think that science is something that's part of their future. Most children don't actually aspire to be a scientist. So it's a pretty large issue to tackle, but just starting to make a few tweaks, starting to think more and reflect more about our practices as teachers could really help some children, and then hopefully all children, start to see science in a slightly different way.
Yeah, and that sort of leads me on to the next talking point, because a really interesting approach that you've mentioned to me previously to aid with all of this, as well as lots of other things, is the science capital teaching approach. And I just wondered if you could share your perspective on this approach and how it could help to create inclusive science classrooms.
Yes, a couple of years ago, I became an accredited trainer of the primary science capital teaching approach. And that was a really significant part of me changing just small little aspects about my practice and really stopping and thinking and reflecting about how I led science at my school, how I portrayed different things when, leading training sessions with teachers and things like that. And it really made me stop and think. And one of the things that was really significant was being encouraged to feel uncomfortable. And that really, really helped me, because I thought that some of the things that I was doing were actually not helping. In fact, they might be really emphasizing that some children ended up thinking that science wasn't for them, which seemed terrible. I was a really enthusiastic science teacher, and to actually stop and realize that some of the strategies that I was using in the classroom, or strategies that I was using as a science lead, were actually hindering, not helping. But what the training course that I did really helped me to do was to embrace that uncomfortable feeling. And the more I could feel uncomfortable and reflect on what I was doing, perhaps not very well, would lead to really meaningful change. And that's what I tried to do. So an example of that, well, I suppose the first example might be what I touched on earlier, and those sciencey pupils in the class, and them dominating the questions maybe, or dominating the answers, or perhaps they might even dominate the population of your science club, for example. So stopping and thinking about who are the non-sciencey ones in the class and how they can be foregrounded. So thinking about their interests and their experiences and how they could be brought into the lesson. So that was a key thing, sort of starting with the child, not starting with my enthusiasm as a teacher and thinking, I've got this great idea, it's going to go really, really well, the children are going to absolutely love it. But taking a bit of a step back and thinking, well, actually, it's not all about me. It's not all about my ideas. What are the children going to bring to the lesson? What experiences have they got already? What interests have they got already? And making sure that I started with them and their interests rather than my bright ideas of how the lesson would go. What's their experience of the lesson? And do they feel that they're part of the science lesson because they've been brought into it and their interests have been foregrounded?
So it's about personalisation.
Yeah, I think starting with the child, making sure that they've got voice and agency, make sure that it's not just real life examples that you might use, but it's actually localized examples, it's personalized examples that you might use. And of course, there is the huge area of building science capital as well, and making sure that you're broadening what counts as science, and you're making sure that you are giving children opportunity to build their science capital. And there are many, many aspects, a huge, big area, but just with a few little tweaks and stopping and thinking and reflecting about how you could enable children to feel more that the science lessons and the science activities are to do with them, I think can make a big difference.
So it's sort of striking me as a mindset first, more than anything, for the teacher to then personalize what they're doing in the classroom and make it relevant for the children.
There's a resource from the Primary Science Teaching Trust there's many different resources that I could mention. Some from Primary Science Teaching Trust, also Explorify. So you might have come across the Explorify activity called Have You Ever? And that activity is very simple. It's got a picture on it and it says, have you ever? So for example, one of them says, have you ever seen a plant growing up through a crack in a pavement? And it encourages teachers to start with what the children might know, or what the children might have seen, or what they might be interested in. So starting lessons using the Explorify Have You Ever is a good, easy way in to finding out about the experiences and the interests of the children.
Okay. And then, so with this science capital teaching approach, if our listeners would like to learn more about it and perhaps get some more resources associated with it, would they just go directly to the Primary Science Teaching Trust, or where could they find this?
Yes, so you can look up the handbook, the Primary Science Capital Teaching Approach handbook, and that would be a really good place to start reading through that handbook. And in there's lots of examples that teachers have made tweaks to their lessons, and they show like little case studies of the different ideas. And I certainly, when I read through the handbook, I tried in my classroom some of I didn't, not all of them, the different ones suit different teachers differently, but I tried some of them out in my classroom, and they're like you say, just a slightly different mindset. For example, thinking who chooses which of the pupil work goes up on display. So, in reality, when you're trying to make your corridors or your classroom walls look really, really good, it may have been that the teacher chooses some of the work to go up, but instead asking the children or a group of children to choose which of the pupil work they think's the most interesting, or they think that other pupils will be most interested in, and then choosing what goes up on the wall, which, really is probably just good primary practice anyway, but stopping and thinking and reflecting about just very small tweaks that you could make like that make a big difference. The other thing, as well as reading through the handbook that people might be interested in doing, is looking at the TED Talk from Professor Louise Archer about should we be making science less fun. The title's probably slightly different to that, but pretty much that. And that's all about how, what I mentioned before, that science might be a pupil's very most favourite subject, and they might absolutely love science, but they might not think that science is for someone like them. They might think it's for someone else.
Okay, thank you for that. So one thing I wanted to talk about as well, and I wanted to just kind of touch upon, were sort of barriers that teachers might face. So I think, most teachers would agree that we all want this inclusivity and equitability. We want to empower our students to really understand and be involved with the subjects. But what do you think the most significant barriers teachers might face would be in making science inclusive?
Yeah, I think that one problem is teaching the same lessons every year, whatever the class, or from a scheme, and not adapting the lessons to the group of pupils or to the class that you've actually got in front of you. So you mentioned earlier about personalising and localising, and I think that's one big thing that often in very, very busy classrooms, and teachers are very busy people, and you've got a lesson or you've got a something from a scheme that you can deliver, that is centered on the learning objectives and covering the key vocabulary and all of that sort of thing, covering the key inquiry skills, but not personalised to the children that are actually in front of you, not taking into account their interests. So I think that's one thing, trying to remember that it shouldn't be the same lesson each time you come to that topic, but it should foreground, as we mentioned before, foregrounding the non-sciencey ones, the non-sciencey pupils in the class. I think there's also the problem of stereotypical attitudes, and I think that can be unconscious ones from parents and from teachers and from pupils. But thinking, when we said about the sciencey ones in the corner or the clever ones, and we give messages all the time, really, without thinking about it and without realizing. And I think parents do as well, you're really good at science is so hard, and I was never good at science at school, and that sort of thing. So the stereotypical attitude, and that might be also to do with gender bias, or with thinking that science is for someone else, not for people like us. Tackling those and working with parents and working with teachers as well to really raise awareness of some of the aspects that we don't really think about, and perhaps we should try and think about a little bit more.
Brilliant. I thought it was really interesting what you said there, where one of the major barriers is that sometimes we are given a scheme and it's sort of a cut and paste lesson. And so therefore it follows that why would most students feel that that lesson is for them and that science is for them? If it really isn't for them, it's not relevant to them, it's not personalized. So then, of course, we're kind of fostering this feeling that, oh, science isn't really for me. So there's kind of a parallel there. And it just highlights how important it really is to do that and personalize it.
Yeah, I think one problem often with primary teachers is confidence in teaching their science and confidence in their science knowledge. So having, wherever it's come from, whether it's a commercial scheme or whether it's a lesson, series of lessons that have been produced by the science lead or by the school, whoever it might be, that's really useful to give the teacher confidence. But the real benefit of a primary school teacher is their knowledge, their real massive comprehensive knowledge of their pupils, which the more expert secondary teacher hasn't got that same knowledge of the pupils and their interests and their perhaps set up at home, or their capabilities and interests outside of school. They might be a fantastic football player or whatever it might be. And the real benefit of a primary school teacher, they might not feel as confident in the science, but what they do feel confident in is knowing their pupils and knowing how to weave in, for example, those great football skills, or being able to weave in that their science knowledge might be able to help them perhaps support their parent more, who is looking after a brand new young sibling in the family. So I think the schemes or rigid lesson planning that sometimes causes maybe a lack of adaptation sometimes, and a lack of personalisation maybe, can be outweighed by the great knowledge of a primary school teacher about their pupils, but they sometimes bring them in to other areas of their day, but not to their science lesson. But if they can bring that knowledge of their pupils into their science lesson as well, then that, I think, will really help build science identity for pupils.
Yeah, I felt it too, that confidence is a big thing in whatever subject you might be teaching. And actually, it's good to recognize that we have something that no AI computer or no other teacher has in our classroom, and that's the knowledge of our students, which we can then pull on to personalise and use the science capital teaching approach. That's really good.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. And we sort of talked about schemes of work there, and I just wonder if there's a way that science leads and school leaders could sort of proactively ensure that the curricula don't unintentionally exclude students without strong science capital. Is there a way that it can be built into the curriculum somehow?
Yeah, I think it's perhaps building it into the whole approach of the school. So raising these sort of issues with professional development with staff, but also stopping and thinking about some other aspects. So, say for example, a science club, and often an oversubscribed science club. But who are the pupils that are attending it? How are they chosen? Is it the people, the parents that sign up the fastest? That press the button first, and those are the pupils that go to the science club. Are there only a certain number of places, so that most pupils don't actually get to go? And I think moving away from optional activities like that to moving those what we might call science club activities into the curriculum so that everyone does them. And I think having the bravery as a science lead to say, no, we're not going to take that opportunity because it's only for 10 pupils. And if we're going to do something like that, we need it to be for the whole year group. And I think that stopping and thinking, is this actually going to reinforce exactly what I don't want to reinforce? If only 10 pupils go off and do this amazing opportunity, does that mean for all of the rest of the pupils that they see those 10 as the sciencey ones? So therefore science is not for them, it's for the ones that got to go on that great trip. And sometimes that's really hard to do. And I think it extends further as well to who's choosing the trip to go on, and which staff even are volunteering to go on that trip. And perhaps we shouldn't be taking on the trip the enthusiastic staff member who says, I'd love to come on the science trip. Perhaps we should instead be taking the teachers who don't really want to go, just like we should be taking the pupils who don't really want to go, that don't really engage in science, that aren't really interested in it, because those are the ones we're going to make the greatest amount of impact on. So I think it can be like on a very smaller scale of thinking about who's answering questions in a lesson, who's getting involved, and making sure that our teaching strategies involve everyone and don't allow some sciencey pupils to dominate. So it's thinking about, as a science lead, thinking about the sort of smaller, perhaps they're not smaller, but the smaller aspects like classroom strategies, to perhaps the larger, more leadership approaches of what should we be setting up our systems in our school? Can we make sure that things that might usually be called extracurricular are actually in the curriculum for everyone to experience, for everyone's curriculum to be enriched, not just for certain pupils to have their curriculum enriched.
So that might be something like a science week or a science fair where everybody does it. Maybe the whole class do some projects together and show all the other classes. Or perhaps if there's a big school-wide competition and everybody has a go.
Yeah, and I think as well, science club style materials, lots are available for free, some that you might buy in. But what I try to do is get those materials and put them into my curriculum wherever they sit best. So they are in our animals, including humans topic, and they're in the lessons. And perhaps people might say, well, there isn't the time to do that. But I think you have to look at the topic and look at what will best suit that class of pupils, and if that's something that could be seen as a extracurricular style activity, should it actually be in the curriculum for everybody to do?
Yeah, I think that's really important. And the science capital teaching approach itself is a really good mindset. Talking about that kind of leads me to talk some more about some other resources that you've been involved with out there. And I've heard some really good things about Sketchbook Science. And I just love it if you could introduce us to Sketchbook Science and explain how it supports teachers and in building inclusivity into the science classroom.
So Sketchbook Science is from the Primary Science Teaching Trust, and it is available as a free download from the Primary Science Teaching Trust website. And it's a series of lessons. Well, I wouldn't say they're lessons, they're more activities. So there are 8 different activities, and they've been developed with I think we had 18 schools that trialled and tested out all the materials and developed them. And they're a combination of science and art. So they're cross-curricular activities that combine both the science skills and the art skills, and really very much keep the rigour of both art and science. And if we think back to when we talked about those sciencey ones in the class and those not so sciencey pupils in the class, one benefit of the Sketchbook Science and their activities and linking the art and science skills is so that perhaps a pupil who might not see themselves as sciencey but really loves art, when they see that the science skills that they're using really enhance their artwork, then they might actually see themselves as sciencey after all. So it's to help build science identity, to make links between the subjects, both ways round. So in the science lesson, it might really help pupils to realise how their creativity that they've been developing in art is actually really, really useful in their science. So there's lots of different activities. We make sure that the inquiry skills are really highlighted in every project. The artistic skills are highlighted as well. The vocabulary for both art and for science. There are teacher instructions of how to carry out the activity, examples of work, and they all match in as well to inspirational artists, so that you can learn about the artists that inspired the project. And they're a real diverse range of inspirational artists as well. So hopefully pupils also get to see perhaps a real range of different types of artists portrayed in the project.
Yeah, that sounds like a real game changer, actually. I think I'm going to run to the Primary Science Teaching Trust after this and see how I can get it into term 2. For sure.
Well, there's certainly one for every sort of topic, every sort of time of year, and there's an activity as well to give you different ideas so that you can bespoke it and twist it and change it to suit what you're teaching and your class a little bit more as well.
Personalise it, make it exactly. There you go. Amazing. And so a really important program that I think primary schools should get involved in is the Primary Science Quality Mark. And I think that now we have this understanding of developing inclusivity and equitability, it would be great to explore a little bit further about how science leaders could use the PSQM framework, which I've spoken about in depth with Jane Turner in episode 1 of this mini-series, to just embed inclusivity into their school's science culture.
Yeah, so the Primary Science Quality Mark is a year-long programme, and it's for science leadership. So science leads undertake the year-long programme, and they really look at their curriculum design, at their teaching and learning, subject leadership, monitoring, strategic planning, all of that sort of thing. And at the heart of it, as you say, is the Primary Science Quality Framework and the vision and the principles of practice. from PSQM, and schools then create their own vision and principles of practice. But at the heart of that is the curriculum design. And the vision from PSQM is that the curriculum will really make sure that all pupils are engaged and inspired and challenged by promoting inclusion and equity. And that's a really important part of the primary science quality framework. And getting science leads to reflect on how they can improve their curriculum design by promoting inclusion and equity is a very important part. So thinking about CPD for the science lead, thinking about how to professionally develop all of the teachers in their school, thinking about how to monitor the impact of what they're doing. The primary science quality mark gives science leads a supporting documents and a framework for doing that, and lots of ideas. We've got a huge ideas bank. We've got many workshops and webinars supported actually by the Royal Society of Chemistry, funding from the Royal Society of Chemistry. But there's a sort of huge wealth of activities, some of them self-directed, some of them more sort of engaging in professional development with other hub schools, with other science leads from other hub schools. But all of that centres back on the reflection of thinking, what I'm doing at my school, is it actually the best that I can be doing? How can I tweak it? How can I improve it? How can I come back to it in a year's time and reflect further on what I need to do? And what support have I got around me, whether that's in my PSQM hub leader, whether that's in the community of experts, of primary science experts, that the hub leader can signpost the school and the science lead to. So all of that sort of wealth of support comes back to the vision and the principles of practice, both of PSQM and of the school, that the school itself develops, and thinking, well, how can I promote inclusion and equity to make sure that my teaching and learning strategies, that my curriculum design are the best that they can be. So certainly the PSQM has got a structure and access to a wealth of support in a variety of different ways to help science leads with that.
Fantastic. In addition to doing something like the PSQM, what advice would you give to teachers or to science leads in taking their first steps? You know, maybe after listening to this podcast episode, what would you tell them the first step should be towards building a more inclusive science classroom?
I think talking to colleagues and not trying to make tweaks and adjustments alone as a teacher of science or as a science lead. I think that these things that we've been talking about need to be as a whole school and led from the head, from the SRT, from all of the teachers discussing together which resources are best to use, which approaches are best to use. Whatever it may be, that tweak, even though those small tweaks could get into your classroom practice very, very quickly after, for example, reading through the Primary Science Capital Teaching Approach Handbook, it's very much a whole school approach would be far more effective. So you could certainly experiment with things in the classroom, say for example with Explorify's Have You Ever, and putting that into schemes, or say for example with some of the other resources like the Primary Science Teaching Trust, A Scientist Just Like Me, which is really good at profiling scientists from all sorts of different backgrounds, but looking at the skills that they use, not what sort of exciting, I don't know, marine biology they do or something, but looking at whether they need to use concentration or perseverance, or they have to be very organised, because those are the sort of skills that pupils could identify with. But I think you could put those sort of resources into your own classroom, but really it comes from conversation and whole school attitudes and whole school approaches, working with colleagues, discussing with colleagues, and that thing that I mentioned earlier about feeling uncomfortable, really having the honesty with each other to say, oh no, I didn't realise that doing that could actually be making the problem worse. I've been saying to them, oh, you are my expert scientist in the room. You're so good at science. And I've been saying that, and I didn't realise what effect that might have on someone else in the classroom. Having that honesty to feel uncomfortable and to think, okay, how could I just tweak a few things to make a few changes, but not alone, as a whole school.
Okay, thank you very much. And then that sort of leads us nicely onto our last kind of topic, which is more the bigger picture in general, the future trends of this kind of way of thinking and sort of looking at that bigger picture. How do you think inclusivity and building that equitability in science connect with sort of broader educational goals?
Yeah, I mean that's a bit of a tricky one, isn't it? That's a bit of a big one. One thing that I've reflected on is that one of the teachers actually from another school that's in my PSQM hub at the moment, who previously did PSQM with me 3 years ago, but is now back reaccrediting in the hub at the moment. She is a reception teacher. And I would say over the last few years, my relationship with her, I've learnt more from her, I think, in some ways, than from many other people. And I'm sure I should tell her that, really, but I perhaps haven't told her that, because I think that those who come from an early years background are doing so many of these things that are talked about in the Primary Science Capital Teaching Approach Handbook, but reception teachers aren't often science leads. They are sometimes, but not that often. And certainly I've learnt so many little tweaks that I can make from her excellent early years practice. So whether that might be really starting with the interests of the children, and she's given me lots of tips for how she finds out and how she utilises their passions and their enthusiasms, down to the sort of choice that she gives them in their activities. And I've tried to adopt some of that, giving pupils more choice. So sort of starting with the child, that voice and agency. I often say to science leads that they should teach science more like a morning subject. And what I mean by that is explicitly teach the science skills. Like in the morning, when you teach English and maths, you explicitly teach the skills for English and maths. And I think science can benefit a lot from being taught more like a morning subject, but I'm adding to that now and saying that you shouldn't just teach science more like a morning subject, but you should teach science more as if you were an early years teacher, and take some of those approaches. One of the big benefits of being a PSQM school, or involved in PSQM, or recently have done PSQM, is that you're invited to a series of webinars funded by the Royal Society of Chemistry. And one of those that's coming up in the new year is by Julian Grenier, early years expert. And I'm very much looking forward to that webinar, thinking what colleagues and what we can learn from our EYFS colleagues, because I think that the answer to that is an awful lot. We can, as science teachers, we can learn an awful lot from their approaches, and certainly how their approaches really support inclusivity.
Thank you very much. We've talked about so many things today. It's felt like it's gone by so quickly, but actually we've been through the Science Capital Teaching Approach, Sketchbook Science, Primary Science Quality Mark. We did our Quickfire 5 and we learned more about you as well. Alex, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and all your insights with us today. And it's been such a pleasure, honestly, to have you on the show. And a lot of the work that you're doing is super inspiring, and you're clearly passionate and making a huge impact. So thank you for giving us your time. And I personally can't wait to see what impact you have in the future in primary science.
Thank you very much. Lovely to talk to you too.
There's so much to take away from today's episode. One of the standout important points for me is how critical it is to personalize each science lesson and make it much more relevant for all of the students in the class. It was also lovely to hear that we, as primary teachers, all know our students so well, that that's a real strength that we can use to build on this approach. It was very interesting to hear about how including every child, especially those who don't identify themselves as a good scientist or those with less science capital, and actually showing them that science can be for everybody, no matter what your background is or your learning ability is. And it's up to us to bridge that gap for them. What I found really interesting was how we could marry extracurricular activities like science clubs into the curriculums, explicitly teach those skills like we do with maths, English. We should do that with science and explicitly teach those skills, which is something that has come up in so many of our previous episodes here on the Primary Science Podcast. And finally, leveraging really good resources like Sketchbook Science, Explorify, and frameworks and programs, just like the Primary Science Quality Mark, can be real game changers in building a strong science culture in primary schools. Alex's advice provides a really powerful starting point for fostering a more equitable, inspiring science education for all of our students. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in to this episode of our Primary Science Podcast mini-series, The Science Leaders Toolkit. Have a great day and see you next time on the Primary Science Podcast. Bye for now.